All right,
authority.
We are here today. It is December 10th, 2016, at the home of Mr. James Brown. And we're also with his sister, Vanessa, who I understand drove up from Anniston, Alabama. So my name is Paul Ortiz. And first of all, Mr. Brown, I wanted to thank you for having us in your lovely home and inviting us in. And
thank you.
Appreciate you taking time out. And we're going to be talking about a number of things, about a remarkable gentleman by the name of Oscar Mack, a story that passes down through the family, kind of the intersection between history, the present, and the future, in many ways, if you will. Mr. Brown, can you kind of start by telling us a little bit about your background, kind of where you grew up, a little bit about your family?
Yes, sir. I am actually originally from Akron, Ohio, baby boomer, born in 1957. My mom and dad, my mom is originally from Akron, Ohio. My father was born and raised in West Virginia. My granddad was also born in West Virginia, so it's sort of like a generational thing there, if you will. I grew up in Akron, Ohio, was educated at the public schools, and I attended and graduated from the University of Akron in Akron, Ohio. Lived there for a few years after that and decided to move away to St. Louis, Missouri for a while, and then from there moved back to Akron and then moved here to Atlanta, and I've been here ever since.
When you were in college, Mr. Brown, what did you major? What did you study?
I actually studied business and transportation. Mm-hmm. I started in pre-med, but I think I was doing it more for my dad at the time than for myself. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to really get involved in humanities, if you will. I really wanted to do social work, but I ended up getting my degree in business and transportation. After I moved here, I got involved in law enforcement. I've been with law enforcement for about 20 years now as a probation officer. Now I'm with community service, and I deal a lot with misdemeanor probationers and felony as well. Mm-hmm. So I've sort of gotten into the humanity part of it because I think I'm more of a social worker than I am law enforcement. I got involved in law enforcement because of the death of our nephew, who was murdered back in 1991 by a 13-year-old kid who was only 19 at the time. So that's why I really ended up in law enforcement.
Law enforcement.
Yes.
When you were growing up, who were your role models?
Well, you know what? I can remember, again, being a baby boomer in the early 60s, I saw a lot of men in my neighborhood who were actually in their homes, black men, going off to work every day. So they sort of became my role models, if you will. My father was a very good example of that. He worked hard all of his life, got up every day and went to work. Mm-hmm. So they were my role models, if you will. Looking back, I can say that many of them were just good, hardworking men who took care of their families.
Yeah.
So that's basically who I really honor and respect.
Very good.
Yeah.
And Mr. Brown, did you have, when you were growing up in the community, did people talk about African American history? Was that a subject you learned in school, or was that kind of?
It was sort of taught in the home. My mom was an avid history buff. She enjoyed history, if you will. She enjoyed really talking about different cultures. She really got into that. She was really intrigued with the Native American population and felt a lot of, I can't really think of the word, she was very concerned about their plight and about what really became of the Native Americans in this country. She was also concerned about the plight of black people at that time. But it was more in a positive kind of way. She wasn't bitter, if you will. Mm-hmm. My father was also very informative, but his came across in a way of being just a bit more bitter towards the behavior of white people towards minority people, if you will. But I got a lot of my education from reading. I was an avid reader. I enjoyed reading about history. I enjoyed reading about Jim Crow and segregation, slavery, I enjoyed getting the knowledge, if you will, not out of pleasure, but I just enjoyed gaining knowledge on what was really happening or had happened at that time.
What were some of your favorite authors or books? Do you remember back in the...
I can't really think of any particular authors at the time. That sort of slipped my mind, but I remember reading books by Up From Slavery, different books like that.
Booker T.
Black
Washington.
Rage.
Yeah.
There were a lot of books that I read, but again, I can't remember their names. Then I also read books that pertain to people who were persecuted in Europe, the Jewish population, what they had to endure the Holocaust. One of my best books that I thoroughly enjoyed reading happened to have been written by Corrie ten Boom, The Hiding Place.
Okay, yeah.
Yes, it almost became like a Bible to me.
Yeah.
Because this woman went through insurmountable odds and survived and walked away basically unscathed.
Yeah. And so it sounds like when you were growing up, history had a real value in your household. That people...
It did.
Yeah.
Yes.
What year did you graduate from high school, Mr. Brown?
1975.
75.
It's a long time ago, huh?
Okay. Those are happening times. And
Yes.
a lot of things, yeah. Were you, as you were learning history and getting involved in things, were you ever involved in any civil rights movement activities or...
I was a bit too young. I was 17 when the civil rights movement was sort of coming to a climax, if you will. But I was always intrigued. Even as a little boy, I was always concerned about what was happening in the world. I was concerned about even going all the way back to the Bay of Pigs. I would sit there and watch TV and wonder what's really going on out there. I was concerned about the civil rights movement. I was concerned about even the political unrest at the colleges at that time. I was really concerned about the what they called hippies back then, or the young kids fighting for rights, fighting against Vietnam, and understanding that the course of the war changed because of domestic pressure. I had a lot of respect for these people at that time because they stood up, they had a voice, they wanted to make a difference. So those were very challenging times, but for me, again, I'll never forget them, and I really mean that, because they helped to shape me as a man I am today.
That's great. Well, you have a very important life history yourself, and at some point I want to get back to that, but I do want to get to the matter at hand with Oscar Mack. And could you tell me when you first encountered the Oscar Mack story in your family?
I had never really heard of his name. It wasn't mentioned. We didn't really know anything about it. I had heard of Lanier Johnson.
Okay.
He was my step-grandfather. And again, there was very little knowledge on him. No one really talked about him per se. But it was in 2001 that I learned of him in a far greater magnitude that sort of changed my life. My grandmother, Florida Hurt, one day Vanessa and I had gone, my sister and I had gone to Akron to visit my grandmom. And my grandmom lived to be 95 years old, a wonderful lady. And we were in the house one day, and it was at the evening time. And she was in her bedroom, and Vanessa and I were there, and my Aunt Melissa, my grandmom's daughter, my aunt, we were all there, and my grandma began to talk about this guy called Lanier Johnson. Well, that was her stepdad, and she said, I want to tell you what really happened. You often ask me why I moved around so much, because she lived in Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Youngstown, Ohio. She moved around a lot. She lived in Georgia for a while with her great-grandma. Great-grandma, she would have been my great-great-great-grandmother, Laura Locks, who lived to be 100 years old. And she said the reason why we moved around a lot was because Lanier Johnson at that time was living in Florida. She said Kissimmee, Florida. And he had gotten a job as a postal worker. Well, as it turns out, this was around 1922 or 1923. The Klan was at its zenith, if you will, during that period. And they got wind of the fact that he had gotten this job. And they were upset. They said that this job was for a white man. He was not deserving of the job. So they told him, you better quit the job. You're not even going to work, not even one day. And we want you to quit this job. If you don't do it, we're going to kill you. Well, a postal co-worker who happened to be Caucasian gave my great-granddad a gun. He said, I want you to hold onto this gun because they're coming out. They're going to try to render harm. So I believe that evening they set out, the Klan came out to the house, to my great-granddad's house. And I believe they wanted him to come outside, but he didn't go out. And as a result, someone shot into the house. One of the Klan's members shot in, and he ended up shooting back. And as a result, he ended up shooting two of the men, and it was fatal for both of them. I believe one got away, but these two men died as a result. So he had to leave on foot. He had to leave everything behind, and he had to leave, and according to my grandmom, he had to travel basically by night, going through the swamps, and he said it was almost like the spirit of his deceased mother was guiding him through all of this bad terrain, all of this swampland in Florida. And finally he made it into Georgia, and then from there, he headed north. Don't really know how he got there per se, if someone helped him at that time. I later learned that there might have been a family who helped him. But he finally made it north. And my great-grandmother, Adele, stayed behind. But they kept a lookout on her. They kept watching out to see what was going on with her. And finally, he sent for her.
Now, by they, you mean
The Klan.
the Klan.
Yes, the townspeople.
So she was already married to him?
Yes. No, she wasn't married to him at the time. Yeah, they didn't marry. Well, this happened in 1923. I think they wanted to marry, but he didn't marry they didn't marry until 1938. I don't know if it was for fear of being identified or what have you, but they never married until then.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Brown, you mentioned Oscar Mack felt he was guided by the spirit of his deceased mother.
Yes.
What do we know about her?
Little information. According to what I've read about her, I don't remember the name per se. It's all written down. Mm-hmm. But I think he was the product of a second marriage on both parents, if you will. I would have to get that information. But don't know a lot about her. Do not know a lot about his dad. I think he did have one brother. Mm-hmm. Okay. But very little information about her. But I can get the names, if you will.
Yeah, that's really intriguing. I mean, she must have had a very powerful influence in his life.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
Yes.
Mm. Do you remember how the two of you reacted or responded when you first heard the story? Were you
shocked? I was shocked, but really, really intrigued. Like, wow. Now everything is beginning to fit together here, it's like this puzzle. Like, okay, Grandma, now I understand why, this happened and this happened here. And, the fact that you held onto the secret all of these years, you didn't even tell our mom about it. She didn't even know about it, And my aunt didn't know until, she was in her 60s that this actually happened.
But it sounds, Mr. Brown, like it had been remarked upon, at least the fact that she moved quite a bit, or that they moved quite a bit, was something that everyone kind of knew, and maybe there was never a reason given for that, except for they just moved around a lot. And whenever my great-grandma, Adele, would have dreams,
And Vanessa's like her. She dreams a lot. She would tell Oscar Mack, it's time to move again. They're on our tail, so we have to move. We've got to move. We have to leave where we are now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
She would actually have dreams about the Klan or about
Yes.
people. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Wow.
They stayed in Sicklerville, New Jersey for a number of years. And then finally moved to Akron to live with, or to be around my grandma.
And do you know, I think I remember in the phone discussion that we had, the phone conference, you were mentioning some of the different places that they lived before Akron. Do you know those places, or?
They lived in Youngstown, Ohio,
Okay.
Hartford, Connecticut. I believe they lived in some town in Pennsylvania. And of course, my grandmother lived here in Georgia, the state of Georgia. It might have been, it might have been Waycross.
Waycross. Okay.
Yes.
That must have been really difficult for them to have to move and just.
Yeah, because again, my grandmother was only 15 when she married, and she had grown weary of moving around so much. So she found a little bit of stability in Akron and ended up marrying my grandpa, who was like 10 years older than she was. She was only 15 when she married, and he was 25. So that was the way that she was able to find stability and settle down.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's so many questions, but I'm trying to kind of focus on a few as we're telling the story. So Oscar Mack becomes Lanier Johnson.
Yes.
But so when you were growing up, you knew him by that name. Or I mean, you didn't know him,
I didn't know him.
but you knew of him by the name of Lanier Johnson.
Right. Because he died January 2nd, 1960 in Akron.
5 years old.
Yeah. So I was only 3 and didn't know him until later, of course, through my dad and through my grandma.
Yeah.
But he adopted the name Lanier Johnson from having served in World War I in France. He was really impressed with the French people. They treated him cordially. They were very nice to him. And I've learned, that a lot of Europeans were more kinder to a lot of African Americans than white America, if you will, here in the States. So he adopted that name, Lanier Johnson.
That's really important because this is one of the areas that we can really trace a little more of his history. If there are military records involved,
Yes.
you may have already done some of that.
He served in World War I, of course, and he enlisted in, I believe, June of 1917.
Okay.
Yeah.
There were a lot of African Americans in Florida who served in World War I, who, as you mentioned, go to France. The regiments, many of those regiments are highly decorated, and they fight so well. The American High Command does not know what to do with them,
Right.
because they go against the stereotype. And so the French High Command actually adopts some of these units and says,
Right.
if you don't want them, then we will, we'll work with them,
Yes.
We're the first American troops to ever to get the Cross de Guerre
Yeah.
from
Yeah.
the French.
So that's one place we could probably do some unit history around if we can find out what unit he served with,
Okay.
and that's a great pathway to kind of get some clues. And even the state archives in Tallahassee has service records. If he ever applied for a pension, now this is a question because he's living under different names.
He did.
And so that if he did ever apply for a pension, then he would show up, and then we would get a service record.
In fact, he did apply for a pension, and he wrote a letter directly to Roosevelt, President Roosevelt at the time. But they said that's a state matter. So they sent that information back to the state of New Jersey.
Okay.
But he did apply.
But you have that.
No, I don't have that information. We probably have it. It's in Akron, Ohio. It's with
Great.
my aunt.
That is great. Wow, that's wonderful. When you learned the story, and you mentioned, you were just shocked, and did you begin to tell it in the family? Did it begin to kind of make the rounds, or how did people in general, how did other people in the family respond to it?
Well, we talked. We didn't talk that much about it until
Years ago.
2 years ago after my mom's death.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we were looking up some information,
Yeah.
and Vanessa can take it from there because I think you can tell it a lot better than I can.
We were at my aunt's house in Akron, and we were in. Jim brought up the subject because he's our family historian, and he asked her, "What was that Laniers Johnson's other name?" And because Grandma did say his name when she told us, and she also mentioned that he was a butcher before he took the United States postal job, and Melissa was trying to remember, and so we went online and pulled your article up, and when we were reading it, and I said, Oscar Mack, and she jumped up, she said, that's it,
Wow.
that's it. Then memories started flooding back. Our grandmother's conversation, everything just started
Wow.
coming back. That's him. And so we just kept reading, and then my aunt went upstairs and got a bunch of letters from a lady named Mita.
Mita Windermere.
Yes, Windermere. And they always talked about $5. Brother, I received your $5. And Jim and my sister-in-law jumped up and said, those were codes. Those were codes. And we're like, okay, because everything always started off, I received your $5. And I can't remember the details of the letters, but there's several letters, I mean, that she has, my aunt has. And you were speaking about the United States Army. I went online, and I wish I had bought those documents where it does have him enlisted.
Wow, okay.
And some about an honorable discharge.
Honorable discharge, yes.
Okay, very good.
Yeah, so we do have that. And also, there's a census with his name, household, it seemed like some brothers were on the census. And my great-grandmother, Adele, hers was, I think her name was on it as well. And I believe, too, like he said, that they didn't get married to protect each other.
Their identity.
Until 1938? Okay.
And when they lived in New Jersey, she stayed in New Jersey, but he had to go find work.
Was it in New York?
Was it New York or New Jersey?
No, he had to find work in New York.
In New York, and
She lived in New Jersey.
New Jersey, okay, and
Right.
she would ask for him to come home a lot. She said, please come home, but couldn't stay there and work.
What do we know about Adele?
My great-grandmother,
Yeah. I mean, she had this really difficult life, all these challenges. I mean, were there any other stories that passed down about her?
Yes. Feisty. Great sense of humor. Great sense of humor. She was an excellent cook. She also worked as a domestic. Yeah. But she died at the age of 44 in 1944, January. Yeah, from a cerebral hemorrhage. Yeah. But sort of Vanessa, I believe Vanessa picked up a lot of her personality. Very spiritual lady, you know, dreamer, but again, very gregarious, very sociable kind of lady. In fact, she was a background singer, according to my grandmom. She was a background singer with Bessie Smith.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah,
That's amazing.
right.
And those dreams saved lives.
yes.
Yes. Absolutely.
She had several dreams, and Grandma
Yeah.
said she'd tell him,
Yeah.
she said, Oscar, it's time to go. She said, they're coming after us.
She would call him old man. Old man, it's time to go. It's time to move. Yeah,
And that was it. It was time to move.
right.
Wow.
He was a very smart man, from what I've gathered. Very smart. For him to have gotten a job with the postal system says a lot. It speaks volume. He worked as a butcher, and when he finally made it to Akron, he established his own business, He had sort of like a novelty shop, if you will, where you sold cigars and candy and bubble gum, things like that. He also worked as a butcher because he was a butcher in Florida prior to his getting his postal job. So he worked as a butcher for a
In
while.
Kissimmee.
In Kissimmee.
In Kissimmee.
Yes. Yeah. He died and my aunt would have to tell you more about that. He was sort of disconnected, sort of maybe a tormented soul, if you will. Very generous man. Vanessa, but my Aunt Melissa and my mom would visit Sicklerville quite often when they were children. And he was a very gentle man, quiet demeanor. They would go to church. There was a church not far from where they lived. But they said that he was a generous soul, just a quiet man who would share with them whatever he had. But when he died in a state, he was living at a boarding house, and his life, I think, had just sort of spiraled out. And he was caught one day running down the street naked. And after that, he just got sick and eventually died.
The job, when we talk about the post office that he was offered, I'm trying to figure out what kind of job it was with the post office.
It was bid.
He was
Okay.
It was a bid.
So a bid for a contract route.
that's right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And he won.
I mentioned this because my wife retired from the post office just a few years ago.
Okay.
And so those routes could be really good business, but you have to be very entrepreneurial. You have to put the bid together. It's very technical. It's complicated. You bid against other people, and I was just guessing. Well, he bid against other white people. He wins the bid because he puts in the better. And I would see my wife help people do this. And delivering the mail, people don't realize how complicated it is. It's very complicated. The mail's always piling up. So he must have been tremendously resourceful.
Yes, I believe he was. In fact, the day that, according to the records, the day that he had this confrontation with the Klan, I believe several days after this, about 200 families, black families, left that area. So we don't know if he had a lot of influence, if he was a leader in the community, but apparently he was a very, very top-notch kind of guy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is kind of a side story, but I wanted to share this with you because I'm just kind of thinking out loud about different connections. So a few years ago, I did a teacher's workshop in Kissimmee. Now, Kissimmee is, for high school teachers who are being trained in social studies. So they're already teaching in the town, but the school board or the principal calls them together and says, you have the assistant professor from UF is coming and is going to teach us, about curriculum in high school or social studies curriculum. And they asked me to do an oral history workshop or to teach them how to do oral history in the school. And so I had a whiteboard and I said, let's start by questions. If we were doing an oral history of African American life and or race relations in Kissimmee, what would be some of the questions? I turn around and at that point I'm just the scribe. And so one of the older teachers who identified herself as 1 year away from retirement said, well, why don't we ask people about the bell that used to ring at the courthouse? And there was silence. And I turned around and I said, oh, what bell? Because I didn't know much about Kissimmee, And the teacher said, well, it was the bell that they would ring. And when it rang, all the black people had to leave town at the end of the workday, unless you were working in a white household, like as a domestic worker or something of that nature. But basically, this was a situation where all African Americans had to leave at sundown or at 5 p.m., whichever came first. And we had a fascinating discussion because the younger teachers they were like, I'd never heard of that, but the older people were like, yeah. What makes it even more interesting was Kissimmee was an old, we used to call this a GAR town. So it was originally settled by Union Army veterans from the North, but they still had these racist institutions like the Bell. Now, I've never followed that story up, but now Oscar Mack in the 1920s is in this town, and this is kind of the environment that he's working in.
So sad.
Yeah, yes, but he finds a way. I mean, it sounds like he's a striver. He's incredibly resourceful, energetic, and he's just not a person that's going to give in. And Florida's bad, but where else are you going to go in 1922, 1923? It's not like the North is that much better, right?
Oh, so true.
What else do we know about Oscar Mack in terms of the records, like any other hints about his character in the 1920s? Do we know anything about like maybe where he went to school at?
No, we don't. As far as we have gleaned, we don't know anything about his education. We don't know how far he got in school.
Okay.
Probably not that far. On my mother's side, I know that my grandma did not finish. They did not have a formal education. I think they stopped maybe in junior high. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And Mr. Brown, you mentioned earlier, I mean, the role, and one of the stories that's coming out here is the critical role of women in your family. Women as leaders, women as dreamers whose dreams can save lives. When you were growing up, did that have an impact on you in terms of the role that women played in your family?
Yes. Yeah, I was taught early to respect women. I think for myself, I don't know. I think I was born with this heart for humanity, and it didn't matter if it was a man or a woman. I think something that was innate that said, you know what, I do believe in human rights, no matter what the gender or the culture, and understanding that I learned early that there's only one race, and that's the human race. I think we have different nationalities and cultures, but we've become so divisive. So I was always an advocate for women. Strong black women. My mother was a strong black woman. My grandma was a strong black woman. My sister is a strong black woman, not negating or taking away from any other group. Mm-hmm. Understand that, but I have to put that out there. My grandma, great-grandma Adele's daughter, was a very strong lady, had a very strong constitution. In fact, when World War II broke out, she was working as a domestic, but she wanted better for her family, for my mom and my aunt. And she elected to get a job at B.F. Goodrich in Akron, Ohio. Wow. And she was one of the first blacks to hire in. So in 1942, she went to work on her first day. All of the Caucasians in the department sat down. They refused to work with her because she was black. So the foreman got up and said, no, this is a federal job. You have no other recourse but to work with her. Mm-hmm. So my grandmother's tenacity not to give in or to give up brought her to a place in her career at Goodrich whereby she became the secretary for the Teamsters Union.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Okay.
What was her name?
Florida, named after the state of Florida. Florida Sanders Hurt.
H-U-R-T?
Yes.
That is an amazing story. And so it sounds like you had some really interesting interactions with her when you all were growing up. I mean, how was she, like as children, what were your first memories of her?
I think, and I'll let Vanessa amplify on that as well, for me, my perspective, I think there was being honest here, because this whole thing is predicated on, our being honest. I think Grandma at that time when I was a little boy was a little bit aloof. Because there was some kind of rift between my mom and my grandma. I don't think they really bonded. I think it was due to the fact that my grandmother had a whole lot of baggage. She lived her life of fear, for what happened to her and her family, her immediate family. So I don't think she really bonded with my mom, who happened to be her eldest. So because of that, she was a grandma in a sense of she was an excellent cook, excellent baker. In fact, she got a lot of her recipes from a lot of people that she befriended who came from Europe after World War II. And they brought a lot of recipes over with them for baked goods, if you will. So she would bake cookies for us at Christmas time and things like that. But there was always there was always a little bit of a wall there that wouldn't allow us to really get to know her. And that persisted for years until we became adults. And as adults, that's when she began to open up more. She would sit and talk to me, and I don't know again why, but I would just sit, and I not only with my grandma, but with older people. Period.
Yeah.
I would just sit and listen to them and glean from their life's experiences, if you will. So as she got older and as we got older, it was then that we really began to bond.
Wow. Well, it's interesting to think about this, kind of thinking out loud, because sometimes when people go through really traumatic events, that creates these kind of boundaries, because then sometimes they're trying to protect younger members of the family from this knowledge. Like, because what could the family have done with that knowledge in the 1930s or 40s or even 50s, right? Except for maybe despair. I mean, maybe that's part of the gulf.
Yes.
But you said as you got older, you began to know her better and
right. And at that, I mean, when she died, there was a tragic loss. It affected, us. I still mourn her death. And because I really got to know her as an adult. And
When did she die?
she died in 2007.
She just died.
Yes, ma'am. June of 2007.
Father's Day.
Yeah, Father's Day. Yeah.
Father's Day.
And my grandpa had been dead. He died, her husband, he died in 1969, so she lived a long time after
What
him.
was his name?
Vanessa, V as in Victor, A-N-I-S, Hurt. They were married in September of 1927.
Where does the Sanders come in at?
Sanders is really her dad. Oscar Mack was her stepdad.
Okay.
Yes.
So Adele already had a child when she ran off with Oscar Mack?
Yes.
Okay.
And they were never married.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did Oscar Mack and Adele have more children?
No,
Okay, so Florida's the only
the only child.
What was her favorite story, or the favorite story you remember that kind of you still resonates? And
After Grandpa died, Grandma really began to live. That's not in a bad way, not in a derogatory way, but I mean, she really began to live. I mean, she was a traveler. She was just like world-renowned traveler. She traveled to Europe, all of the islands, most of the islands in the Caribbean. She enjoyed entertaining. She would invite people into her home. She enjoyed people. She enjoyed giving of herself. But I think, and I remember her telling me, maybe several years before her death, she said, "You know what, Jimmy," she called me Jimmy or Jim, "the world doesn't owe me a thing." She would say that quite often. The world doesn't owe me a thing, because she lived well. Very dressed well, lived in a wonderful, comfortable home. She wasn't the typical grandma, if you will.
she was the secretary of her union local and
Local.
wow,
Goodrich.
that's amazing. And did she, when you were, as you were, were there other family members who she kind of bonded with in later years, in like other relatives? Do you, I mean, the question I was also going to ask is, did you all ever have like a reunion or kind of a get together or holidays where a lot of people would get together in the family? Or was the family kind of more
Very
decentralized?
private. And I think because of the way she was raised, she was very private. And she was very comfortable in her own,
Element.
very comfortable, strong woman.
So
Yeah.
how many children did she have?
Two daughters.
Melissa and your mother.
Mildred.
Mildred. And Melissa's still around.
Yes, ma'am.
Does she have children?
Never married.
Small family.
Yeah.
Just 4 grandchildren.
Right. I think she sort of lived vicariously through her children, Grandma did, because she missed out on her young years. You know, so she would go to the football games with my mom and Aunt Melissa. She pushed education. And for back then, my mom and aunt both graduated high school. My Aunt Melissa is a what kind of singer was she?
More like an opera singer.
Yeah, she actually went to New York. Yeah, lived in New York for years. Almost made it to Carnegie Hall. Yeah, and Vanessa also picked that up too. She's a vocalist. Yeah, yeah.
Mr. Brown, you mentioned earlier a person I remember in our phone conversation, Meta Windermere.
Yes.
What do we know about her?
Very little. According to the letters that we had gotten or that we had read in Akron, I thought that she might have been black.
I thought she was too, and I thought she may have used another name as well to protect herself.
Were they different addresses? Do you remember the envelopes?
Yes.
Okay, so the address changes all the time.
They didn't change all the time, but there were times that, you know, there
And
would
there
be
were letters written to
Oscar Mack.
Oscar. Okay.
Now, do you recall if he he did respond,
He did,
correspond.
yeah, but she did most of the correspondence.
Well, you would know because that would go off for her. You
Yeah,
had to find her.
yes, he would respond to her. But there weren't many from him. They were
No.
basically a lot from her. And it was
Right.
always about, I received the $5.
Right. And she would talk a lot about God. A lot about God.
Do you remember if the letters were from Florida or were they from
They were actually, I believe they were from Florida.
They were.
Yes.
And they were addressed a lot to New Jersey.
Yeah, Sicklerville, New Jersey.
And she would, one time she mentioned she needed some money for a furnace, a heater.
Yeah, exactly.
It was a heater.
Yeah. And she knew about our great grandma's death. She did respond, you know, by saying she was very sorry to hear of her passing. The letters, again, I think they range from maybe 1933 all the way up to 1946.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that's a mystery. We need, yeah. So we'll be looking into that. That's amazing.
When you mentioned that you looked them up on the census, was that Linnea Johnson you looked up or Oscar Mack?
Oscar Mack.
Okay, so you found them on the census in Florida.
Yes,
So, did you find like brothers and sisters listed?
I did.
Okay.
Seemed like someone's name was William.
He had one brother.
Google that bad boy.
Yeah.
It was a William.
He had one brother, I believe.
Yes, and they mentioned the parents.
Okay.
Yeah, because we have the state census to work on and we have the federal census to work on. Because the state of Florida did a census.
Well, she was able to find it. We can find that too. And,
Yeah.
That's all online.
Put down
Yeah.
his relatives.
And there's the manuscript.
Yeah. I might have the right relatives.
I had a folder, I wish I had brought it with me, that I collected, you know, where I went online and printed things off, you know, even your article, but the census, I printed that off, I even took pictures and, what was the thing?
Which article, Vanessa?
The one, from the college.
Oh, that's not him.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So that's Julian's,
Yes.
right? Yeah, Julian Chambliss. Because I was going to ask you about that too.
I
Like when you.
apologize,
Oh no. Whereas I love Julian. We worked together for many years.
All those academics look alike.
books.
Oh, yeah.
Newspaper clippings.
Oh, yeah.
I printed that off as well.
Yeah.
Where they
Take
couldn't
some
find
pictures
his
with your camera.
body.
Take some pictures with your camera.
I will.
Email them.
You can actually, I
Yeah,
can actually
yeah.
pull them up and.
Yeah, because one article even talked about this. These killings or slayings made it all the way to the New York Times. All right, and of course the local paper in Kissimmee, and it was really biased. I mean, these Klansmen were made out to be saints.
Right.
You know.
And these were, yeah, I mean, this is, I mentioned earlier, the Ocoee massacre was the same thing. I mean, the Orlando Sentinel idolized the mob, which really was the American Legion, which went out even more than the Klan, and took control of Ocoee and burned people out of their homes. But the Orlando Sentinel made it appear as if the American Legion had come to restore order, which was not the case at all. So the Oscar Mack struggle, which is happening just 2 or 3 years later, the newspapers is still in that same mode, where the attackers are actually lionized, as you mentioned. But speaking of Julian, I wanted to also think back to what was your response when you ran into the article and
We
Were you
were
like,
all
wait a minute?
sitting there as a family,
Yeah.
excited. We
Yeah.
were on the edge of our chair. We sat there for about 4 or 5 hours
Yeah.
in my aunt's breezeway, and we were like, oh my God, it was like a light turn on. And this happened, and the fact, and we even laughed, we chuckled, and then there were times we were sad, thinking about that this man had to live a secret life. And then we start thinking about our Grandma, thank you. Thank you for sharing this knowledge with us. But we were just so oh my God, this is history, especially when they couldn't find his body. That got me.
Right. Yeah.
That got me, and I thought, man, you made it.
Yeah.
You made it.
Because that's what Curtis Mack, Mickelson, he was like, the day that I contacted him, he was walking around Lake Jenny Jewel. And he was saying, this is where Oscar Mack had met his demise. Because they were assuming that he had been murdered at Lake Jenny Jewel.
the newspaper headline was very lurid, and I believe, if I understand Curtis and Julian, it was something to the effect of, like Jenny Jewel runs red with Negro's blood.
Wow.
Really lurid, and that was very typical at that time. But and kind of a pride and a lesson in terror, to other people and to the 200 people who fled.
Vacated the area.
What happened to them, to their lives.
Right.
And this is such a critical story. But so you read it. Now, did you see the article or did you see the website first, or both?
We saw the website
The
first.
website first, and we had the knowledge,
Mm-hmm.
so we just had to Google it, and all the stuff just started coming. All
Yeah.
the information started just was presented right in front of us.
Right.
Okay.
And it was, oh my gosh, and even there were some other things that had occurred prior to that was included in one of the articles as well. But I have to go back to the Nicholson. It seemed like he took it personally
Yeah, he did.
because
Yeah.
he was trying. It was like it got to his heart.
Yes.
It got to
It
his
did.
heart.
I've known Curtis for many years, and he's a wonderful, wonderful person. He was one of the organizers of a group called Democracy Forum in Ocoee, and this was one of the first groups to actually bring the Ocoee massacre back into public attention against opposition. The mayor, none of the power structure in Ocoee wanted that story told about the Ocoee massacre. So you'll see Democracy Forum, they actually had public forums. They even had one, I think, at Barnes & Noble in 1997 or 8. And they were denounced by all the city leaders. Why are you bringing this up? This is history. It doesn't matter. You're just going to make people upset. You're just kind of stirring up, bad things. But they were persistent. And it was a very courageous group of people. And Curtis was one of those kind of key individuals who didn't get any thanks, but why are you bringing up this stuff? That's how I met him when I was a grad student at Duke, because I was working on kind of a statewide study of Florida, And when he called me, and I couldn't believe someone was actually working on this locally, because you can go to a Coe and you can see where the black community used to be. There's brick that has been sanded over. There's houses, you can see the old foundations where people used to live, but had to leave within a period of days. White realtors came in and took over the property.
And I think we have sort of this different version of the state of Florida, because I used to think, Florida is not really considered, to me, it wasn't at the time deep south. To me, it wasn't. But then I learned, that Florida had the highest lynching rate than any other state in the union.
They had really good PR, I always say, because, I think they've been able to escape from being considered part of the Deep South.
The World's Fair in 64, and every time there would be a World's Fair, the Florida History Exposition would be controlled by Disney.
Range Rovers?
Yeah, essentially Walt Disney began to tell the story of the... And so, okay, so you found out, I want to kind of go back to this moment where your family discovers or begins to connect with Curtis Mickelson and Julian Chambliss. When did you first call them? Did you call Curtis first? Did you call Julian first? Or?
No, I actually emailed Curtis. I went online and I went to the website and just typed out an email. Sir, I have some information that is pertinent to this Oscar Mack that you need to hear, that you need to know. He didn't die. He lived.
You have to go and Phil Curtis say, what did you think?
How did he? What was his initial?
He responded back. He was like overjoyed. I mean, it's like, oh, you're kidding. So we got on the telephone, and I told him what happened, and he was really, 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 elated because of the fact that he did not die, because it really bothered him, because he thought that he had been murdered by the Klan. Yeah.
And see, long after he had contacted you and you had your interactions, and I was later down the chain of communication, and Julian had contacted me and Curtis, and they were and I was flabbergasted. I was like, really? I mean, what an amazing story.
Yes.
I mean, they must have just been. And so, did you contact Julian next, or did Curtis?
No, Curtis.
Oh, put you. Okay.
Curtis contacted Julian. Yes.
Yeah, because they did the whole class. Because Julian does these wonderful special topic seminars, and so the Oscar Mack lynching was the subject of that year's.
Yes.
So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Wow, that's an amazing. And so, and I know Julian is just so. His students too. I would love to get their responses because they worked on that for quite a while.
Yes.
Yeah.
On that project. So we need to kind of tell them as well. What do you hope to, what does this story mean to your family?
Vanessa and I have talked quite a bit. We do have an older brother living in Akron. We had our eldest brother died in 2000, so he knew nothing about this. He did know Lanier Johnson, but he knew nothing about his background. Vanessa and I have talked extensively about Oscar Mack. For me, I feel like now he can be heard, even from his grave. I mean, we can be his voice, It hasn't made me bitter. I believe it's making me a better man. I refuse to succumb to any kind of oppression. For the color of racism, to me, is fear. And the oppressor has oppressed many people, but then the oppressor is also oppressed himself. This means a lot to me, not only for him, but for all of the other people who are lying in their graves who were never heard, who were treated not even as second-class citizens in this country, not only for black people, but for Hispanic, for women, for any other minority group, if you will. We had talked about the fact that our government is saying, make America great again. I cannot see where she was ever great. By the mere fact that in this country, over 50 million Native Americans were murdered in this country. And black people were enslaved and other ethnic groups were disenfranchised. So it was never great, but I do believe now, because of the stories that are coming about, that are resurfacing, if you will, we can use these as a tool
Right.
to bring people out of their ignorance. You know, I often heard, you know, that to educate one means to bring them from ignorance.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is a tool that will be used to help people to overcome their fear of whatever it might be.
Yeah. And we want to talk about, you know, the educational outcomes that your family really wants for this project. If you were talking to a group of high school social studies students, I mean, what's the takeaways for them from this story? What are you trying to get across to them?
No matter what, you can survive. The odds may be against you, as they were for Oscar Mack, but he survived. He made it. He might have left this planet, you know, he didn't leave unscathed, but he was a remarkable man. He stood up for his rights. You know, they came out to kill him because of a job that was pretty much designated for white people. So you're gonna kill me because I'm trying to make a living. And I want them to walk away with, you know, the problem in this country is economics. And we have been so dehumanized that, you know, when I look at you, I think of your occupation and I think of your money, but I don't think of you as a human being. I think we've gotten so far away from that. I often tell people I have to deal with misdemeanor and felony probationers, you know, that we've become so numb in our culture that a young man will say, you know what, you stepped on my shoe, and because of that, I'm going to kill you. It's never about stepping on the person's foot, but you have become so skewed in your thinking that the shoe is more important. And even back then, this whole thing has been about economics, if we can really call it for what it is. It's economics.
So I was wondering, Paul was talking about how lurid the headlines were for this. So why do you think that they put out those headlines that said that he was dead? What do you think were the purposes of that?
Because I believe what they assumed, that he had been killed.
We spoke about this, that they had to come up that he was dead, because I figured being a Klansman, then it would have been their life. You let a black man get away? You really did? You let him get away? So they had to wipe the egg off their face. That's why she kept having dreams they were coming. They never stopped looking because they knew he wasn't. The ones they sent to kill him. Now, somewhere in the article they said that a black man was killed.
But they never recovered the
They never
body.
recovered the body. So they had to report back maybe to the sheriff in the town, I don't know. Yeah, we got him. Because if they hadn't, it was almost like a mob. In other words, maybe like a drug dealer, they sought out to kill that person. But they got to come back to, we did the job.
Right.
So it's the same spirit.
Yeah, and because it was mobilized so quickly, it's likely that there were people, it's a strong possibility, there were people in law enforcement, political leadership, who actually took part in the organizing. People don't just come together in random. You know, you have to have, there's a leadership structure of these things.
Right.
And so they were humiliated. I mean, Oscar Mack humiliated them.
Right. And again, there was never a body produced.
There are a lot. I mean, I have a lot of questions about both how we want to kind of proceed with the larger project. There's a couple others I was thinking about as we were talking. One, have you been to Kissimmee? Have you traveled there?
Yes. For the amusement park. I mean,
Okay.
For
That was it.
Orlando, yeah.
yeah.
Did you think at that point,
We had no knowledge.
You had it all right, yeah. Yeah.
No.
Have you thought about going back back since?
I don't know why, but I don't know. It just seems like it may sound bizarre or crazy, but it seems like, you know, when I thought of Kissimmee, when I thought of Orlando, when I thought of all of that region, you know, it was sort of like happy thoughts because of Walt Disney. But it seems like now that it's changed me a little bit. That there was a dark history there, not only for Oscar Mack, but for a lot of people whose lives were discounted.
Right.
I guess more, I would like to go just to walk and bring closure for them, for him. Just, I know we could do it this way, but it would, for me, I feel like I would like to go, even if we find out that he has some family there,
There's
to
a
meet some
1920
family.
census.
Yeah.
So that's such a close to the time that he's leaving, we might be able to find out where he lived.
If you'd like us to go with you, we'd love to go.
Yes.
We'd love to host you in Gainesville, show you around the University of Florida, you know, the oral history program, and we do really good open houses.
His wife bakes really good.
Yeah, she is extraordinary. She spent 2 days baking for our holiday party. So yeah, we would love to have you in Gainesville.
Thank you.
Please.
Be
Yeah.
honored. I would be honored. No, I had to come with my brother.
We need to hunt down where that census and see if we can find some of those Macs.
Yeah, and see, the online census is interesting, has really good information, but then behind the online census, there's also a manuscript census, which often is not published, but which should be in the state archives.
Of course, you never know, because remember we were looking for those census on Florida?
Yeah.
And every one he wanted, we'd look at, there happened to be a fire.
Yeah,
that
when,
burned
yeah.
them all. It was really hilarious.
Well, and the AAHP, yeah, the Rosewood, a lot of state documents relating to racial atrocities. So, I mean, like the Rosewood Massacre, for example, there was a grand jury that met, but the records have been lost. The AAHP Massacre, there's a grand jury that met, the records have been lost.
Somewhat convenient.
Exactly. Yes, the Newberry mass murder lynching, the records have been lost, and the pattern goes.
Florida's
Yes,
amazing.
Florida is really
And I thought Mississippi was bad.
Me too. When I went to Mississippi, I met people there who told me they were really kind of scared to go to Florida. Are you serious?
Yeah. Dr. King. I'm looking at this wonderful photograph, and I wanted to ask you about that. I mean, this is an amazing. To me, this is one of the most powerful photographs in American history, but. One of my friends, Bob Fitch, a dear friend, was the official photographer for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. I don't think he didn't take that photograph. That was maybe an Ernest Withers photograph, but Bob would be in these meetings with Dr. King and Ralph Abernathy and other leaders, and he would say, whenever the topic of Florida came up, like, should we do something in Florida? Should we go to Florida? There would be a silence around the table. And people would say, no. Because the one foray that SCLC made into Florida was in St. Augustine.
I remember that.
It was Andrew Young came there and was beaten down by the police in broad daylight, and it was really a violent, yeah.
Don't hear of many protests being held in the state of Florida except for St. Augustine. I can't recall King going there.
Well, and that was the one time. And so what happened in Florida, I mean, Florida's SNCC, we talk about Freedom Summer, but in Florida it was CORE. And so CORE had projects, but they were run by local people, like local college students, like especially Florida A&M. And they were heavily pitched, a lot of violence, incredible heroism. And we've been really privileged in our program to be able to interview a lot of those activists. But because they didn't get that kind of national media coverage, except for St. Augustine. Those struggles have become really obscure, but equally as important as anything else. But yeah, there's a palpable fear about the movement coming into Florida. We can tell you a lot of stories about that, but what is that? I'm looking at this photograph now, and it's an amazing image of Dr. King with Jesse Jackson, Ralph Abernathy. They're at the Lorraine Motel. What does that photograph mean to you?
A good friend of mine gave that photograph to me some years ago. I've always been a great admirer of Dr. King. And I actually worked extensively with Hosea Williams. I don't know if you're familiar with Hosea.
Wow.
I learned a lot about him. I volunteered with his program at one time, and I learned that the media had really made him out to be an ignorant and unlearned man, but he wasn't. I mean, he had a master's degree in chemistry. So he was very learned, but he had a passion. And it was Dr. King who really took him from a state of hatred to a state of love. So when I look at that picture, I think of the fact that, Dr. King only lived to be 39, but he made such an impact on the world, if you will. And he was an extremist. And it was about love. And that's what I try to base my life on, living my life through love. So I greatly admire him. I understand that his love wasn't weak, but it was very, very powerful. I think a lot of people equate love with being very docile and very weak, but it wasn't. And so when I look at that picture, I see a man who laid down his life, for a truth that everyone needed to be a part of, black and white.
And there's a connection really between him and Adele and Oscar Mack and
Absolutely.
that,
Yeah.
wow.
So do we have a plan that we're going to go forward with?
Oh yes, well we should take the opportunity to talk about kind of where we want to go from here. I mean, there are other questions, and but we should definitely plan to do a follow-up interview, because when we leave, the minute we leave here, we're going to think of 10 questions, and you're going to think, and you're going to think of 10 questions. I mean, yeah, this is just, our experience, right? But so we'll plan to do kind of a follow-up, but then we also want to talk about getting to Ohio, whether we want to kind of do a group trip up, and then also, staying connected, obviously, with Joyne and Curtis, because we've kind of agreed to. And then really the other thing, which in some ways is the capstone, is what are some of the different educational outcomes that you want really to come out of this? And it doesn't have to be, either or, it can be all of the above. And it doesn't have to happen overnight. And we can be open. I mean, Deborah and Venetia can tell you about like some of the educational programs that we do. Some of the very conventional kind of academic-y things like, public panels, kind of having a panel, getting the word out about a certain event. We do documentaries, we do podcasts. I don't know, if you do like iTunes, like how you like download your music. And so we do an iTunes podcast, which is building a pretty big audience. That's one way to get the word out. But there are many different ways.
Yeah, so it would be nice to have you sit down and really think about the story of when you first were having that conversation with your family and you decided to pop on the computer. To get that all down and the things that you found. Because, it's almost like a research project. The trail of Oscar.
Yeah.
So it could easily be presented as a collaborative research project, where people start to research their people, they contact others, and
Yeah.
I think that might be, that could be a neat little documentary or whatever.
Yeah, like a History Detectives. Do
Right.
you ever watch that program, History
Yeah.
Detectives?
No.
It starts with a mystery, like a question, and then you have these folks go and do different types of research. One thing I'm thinking out loud is where we interview Curtis and Julian separately, maybe some of Julian's students who are in that seminar,
Right.
and get their thoughts about, just kind of doing it in a way that they don't yet know the outcome of the
Right.
story, but there's these different paths that are going to converge at
Right.
some
'Cause
point.
that's exactly what happens.
Yeah.
Is that, yeah. Because when you get online, one of the reasons why you find out so much is this website. Yes. Yeah, so I think that interconnectedness is just really, really interesting. It just shows you the power of the computer and social media.
Right.
You know, bring
Yeah.
people out and bring history together and correct history. The tools of oppression, media.
Yeah.
Well, what do they say? If you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it.
That's what they say.
So, that's what they say.
And I think it's because they say that because we don't see the American history.
Yes,
Right.
right. Yes.
It's like a feedback loop.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So maybe, kind of bullet point that little path that you took. Yeah.
Well, my brother's very inquisitive. He believes in asking questions. He's always been very interested in family history, and my aunt, she's 86, and he likes to keep her mind going. He even did my mother the same way. But tell me the story. He's been doing it since he was a little boy, and he has such a strong memory of dates, as you can see. Remember dates down to the time of the year, the date, the number, the month, whatever. But he asked Aunt Melissa. He said, "So tell us about our great grandfather, Lanier Johnson." And that's how it always started. He'll go get the photo albums from upstairs and bring the photos down. Now, who was this? And he's always been very intrigued in finding out what this person was about. Always. And he shares it with everyone. So that's how it all started, was because of him.
And I think, again, we have such a rich history, being that, we're the fourth generation out of slavery. So we knew our great grandmom on my grandpa's side as well. Great grandma Hurt, who was born in 1869, but she was alive when I was a little boy. So I remember her very well. But again, a very, very strong woman. Not a bitter woman, but just a very positive,
Very strong.
force man. 1869, so her parents and her siblings were born into slavery.
Right.
And they did not become idle, like I said, in the bitterness. They took
Right.
it and took advantage of it and says, "I can do better." My grandmother, Florida, was a strong, hard-working woman
Right.
that scrubbed walls before she got the job with Goodrich, did day work, saved money. Grandpa says, "I know you've got some money hidden somewhere. Come on now, And
Yeah. Well, she saved $400 during the Depression
Wow.
to buy a house. $400.
amazing.
Yeah. It was a down payment on a house. Yeah. She would work, like Vanessa said, scrubbing wallpaper and all of that. And at the time, her, she had hernia.
Yeah.
And she would just push it in and continue working. Wow. Yeah. Just a very strong lady. Yeah.
She knew how to make too.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see about that. I want to make sure I get this family tree right.
The family tree is very important.
Yeah. And there's the two children, Melissa and Mildred. And what was Mildred's husband's name?
John. That's that would be our dad, John.
John.
That would be our father, John Brown. He and my mom, my dad, both of them passed within a year of each other, but they were divorced. Yeah. Well, I want to get a picture of, so that you can sort of put the name to a face of my grandma and grandpa.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, I'll be right back.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Oh, I can't leave.
Yes, you
Oh,
can.
yeah, no, yeah. Yeah, we can pause, yeah.
Well, you know what?
You can't leave because you're stuck.
My grandma, this is great grandma Adele's daughter.
It's amazing. And she's smiling. Remember we were talking earlier about people told not to smile?
She was sort of a rebel, you know.
Yeah.
And this is our grandmother just a few years ago. That's
Wow.
the young lady that you.
Oh, Deborah, you want to get, Deborah's going to want to get
Yeah, okay.
also.
Okay.
Get that.
And this is Grandma and Grandpa. This is
Oh, wow, that's a great photograph.
probably from the 1930s. It might have been. Oh, this is Melissa Hurt. I don't have an older picture of her right now, but that's.
Wow, what a great
her.
photograph.
That's
I love the
Who
hat.
are these two people?
This is such a cool hat.
my grandmom and grandpa.
Hang on.
Their names?
Florida Hurt
Okay, so
and
that's Florida.
Vanessa. Yes.
Florida and
Vanessa.
Vanessa.
Yes, ma'am.
And then this?
That's her.
Okay, that's
Uh-huh.
Florida. And then this one?
That's Florida.
Okay, that's
Yes.
Florida too.
Right.
You know the year of this?
That would be, she said that was taken around 1937. That was, I think, in the early 30s. And of course,
Oh, yeah, that we should get that on camera too.
that was,
I can hold this.
we would say that's what,
Lucky
circa,
picture.
around maybe.
Jackie Kennedy.
That's Melissa. Melissa Hurt. And of course, my mom and
Got that.
my mom and dad here.
You got it. Okay.
Mom and dad there. And
Love that.
The Akron Zips.
that's right.
There's some colleagues who taught at Akron,
Yes.
and I asked them, "What is a zip?" They said, "I've never seen the mascot."
I don't even know. I don't even care.
Right, yeah. We go to when we do our field work in the Delta. Sometimes we'll do panels at Delta State University, which is in Upper Delta, and their official mascot is the Statesman. So for years they'd have this old guy dressed, or someone dressed as a stereotypical Uncle Sam, walking along the sideline of a football or basketball game, and they figured out the Statesman did not inspire fear in the opponents that they were playing, and so they actually came up with a new mascot, the Fighting Okra.
Because that's a fearful, scary thing.
So now they have a guy that's dressed in an ochre costume who, stalks the sidelines. So
I don't like okra, so.
Oh, yeah, I
Yeah, so
understand.
that
Yes.
is a
Yeah.
fearful and scary
Yeah.
thing. Is there okra in there?
You know what?
but okra is spiny. It's a really tough plant. So
Until you cook it.
until you cook it, yeah. But I always thought of the Fighting Zips in the same way. I think I wonder what the mascot is. It's a great we
Okay.
had.
Again, who is this?
That's
That's great grandma Adele. Her real name was Dorothy. Dorothy Johnson. And that would be Oscar Mack's wife.
Okay, so her real name was, so she changed her name too.
Well, they called her Dell for Adele. But it would have been Dorothy Adele.
Okay.
Yeah.
and we actually have a date for that photograph, which is 1949. Is that right?
Yes.
On this
The wedding, yes.
This one we don't know a date for.
Circa, you would say, what, maybe the early 1920s?
Okay. That's just a great outfit.
We were laughing at it.
She's just killing it there.
I mean,
She is.
People could wear that today, and she'd be like,
I thought
Yeah.
that was me, and I said, when did I dress up in that?
yeah.
That's great.
Okay, and this is your mother?
our mom and dad.
Okay.
And he also knew Oscar Mack. In fact, he used to work for a funeral home, so he helped to orchestrate his funeral, if you will.
Well, that was another question I was going to ask. Is we should go when we go to now. Is he interred in Akron?
Yes.
So we should go and visit.
In fact, my aunt is preparing a memorial tombstone because they didn't have one for him at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But so she's going to be ready next year, I believe. But they're going to put his real name on, Oscar
Wow,
Mack,
that's
and in
great.
parentheses put Lanier Johnson.
Okay, that's amazing.
Down this family.
We should be there. We should go and film that. I'm thinking also we've worked with families in the past. I'm thinking there's one gentleman in particular. His grandfather had fought in World War I. He came back and he was terribly treated, in Florida. And we worked together we did an op-ed about him, and we made the op-ed about the struggles of African American and World War I veterans. When they returned home, they were supposed to be thanked and honored, and they were not. So we might want to think about some kind of collaborative op-ed, or you could write the op-ed, and think of a way to get this into Florida newspapers, like in Orlando, Kissimmee, Gainesville. I'm just thinking out loud here of different types of outcomes. That would be more like a 900-word essay. But I know a lot of editors who would be interested in the possibility of publishing that kind of thing. So that's one audience,
Yeah. And the two of them could talk about the research about finding all this out. That would be a really interesting thing for people, because people are all interested in their past and their background and where they came from and things.
There's been a little bit of movement at the Orlando Sentinel. They have never fully, so many institutions have a lot to own up to. And the American media is one of those.
Yes.
The Florida Times Union was, they would, people would be lynched or brutalized, and the newspapers would actually play a role in again, lionizing those things. But the Orlando Sentinel I remember when we did the commemoration about the Ocoee Massacre, they did come out and talk about the concept of trying to kind of make things right again. They didn't come out and issue an apology for the role that,
Reconciliation?
kind of like that, more, maybe a little too watered down for our taste, but, there's an opening there that maybe we can use the story to
Yes.
open more.
You just mentioned one word. What was the word you just said?
Reconciliation?
Yes. That is my platform. That's my platform.
That's excellent, because that's helpful in terms of thinking of these different educational outcomes.
Yeah.
Excellent. We're working on a book right now of African American history in Florida. We have, since 2009, we've conducted about 500 oral histories with African American, primarily elders, throughout Florida and the Gulf. And so we've talked about, maybe this could become a chapter in that story. And again, just kind of thinking out loud.
Yes. Yeah.
I think it's very enriching. You had asked about, how much of the African American history did we get from home? Again, most of it did come from home. When I was in high school, and Vanessa, you remember, we went to a predominantly white school, and they gave us 1 week of African American history. 1 week.
Well, yeah, it was
1
Black
week,
History Week.
and yeah, right, and
Yeah.
I graduated in '74, so.
same
Same
here.
year.
Yeah.
Yeah, 1 week.
Do you remember what they talked about for that 1 week?
I remember walking away with this information, that a slave could have been born, could have gone his or her entire life without having bathed. That's what I walked away with.
Wow. Okay.
Yes. So we got
Booker
most
T.
of it.
Washington and Peanuts.
Yeah,
Oh,
the
yeah,
peanuts.
they really
thing.
brought that
Harvard, yeah.
Yeah, right.
The church
I know that
really gave us more
Yeah.
information.
George Gardner.
Yeah,
Sorry.
George Washington.
Well, yeah, and even, I remember,
Booker T. though.
yeah, the tragedy, there's so many tragedies. One is, I did field work in Tuskegee, Alabama for several months as a grad student, and George Washington Carver was actually a really courageous person, but that wasn't the George Washington Carver that's usually taught in school. It's like the Peanut Man.
Yeah.
You know, it's
Or Eli Whitney.
yeah. Oh yeah.
Cotton
The
gin.
thing, yeah, yeah.
That was about it.
It's about other people's, histories, really.
Oh yeah, we in my school they would do all kinds of history and English classes. And so they did one on Irish history. They had South American sea tales and all this stuff. And so we wanted a Black history class, and they told us, well, there just really isn't enough Black history to do a Black history class, but we could do a minority history class and maybe put all these and maybe come up with enough for a class.
Put our heads together.
There wasn't enough Black history for a Black history class.
Wow.
400 years.
You know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh.
Exactly, like the Bob Marley song. Well, should we think about where kind of our next, we've been kind of brainstorming about our next steps. Should we think about when is a good time to go up to Ohio?
Yes.
Okay,
We gotta
you don't want to go.
go. We, the winters, the driving and
May. May?
Yeah, May too.
Yeah, and April might just a little bit better.
Yeah, for you.
I mean,
And my
that's
aunt,
for me.
my aunt is
It's still cold up there, though.
doing pretty well. She's 86 now, but still mine is still
Excellent.
pretty sharp.
When we had the phone conference and we were, the name Windermere came up. I mean, I think I jumped to a conclusion. I was thinking, because we were talking, you and I, we were all kind of brainstorming. Well, who was this meet at Windermere? And I think Curtis or Julian said, well, there's the wealthy Windermeres in Central South Florida. But based on what you have said, I'm not sure that that may be the wrong way of thinking about it, because we'd have to look at the letters to kind of really get anchored.
See,
Yeah, because
See,
the
that
name could be
postal stamp
assumed.
is-
I mean, the name might not even be.
Right.
I mean, it sounds French.
You know what? It could be assumed.
sounds white to me.
Yeah,
It's-
it does.
Yeah, I mean, when you said Windermere, I thought, oh, some white folks.
Yeah, but
Maybe it's
or
like-
Mita. I mean, you don't hear. But I'm thinking again. What about? Did somebody finance him? I'm sure that something. He didn't walk all the way to New Jersey.
Was it underground?
Was there some sort of?
Could have. I mean, what we know about. I mean, the story that comes to mind is actually Paul Robeson's father, and that's an earlier generation. But he
Right.
literally does, in fact, walk out of the South into New Jersey, where Paul Robeson is born. Now, but there is an underground railroad. There are people who help him flee the South. And so there are different trails we might be able to pick up as we look at the correspondence. It could have been a fellow veteran. It could have been, yeah.
I think it's important because I think, and again, I think you probably understand this. Sometimes history becomes, well, obviously it becomes one-sided. But I'm thinking, and the reason why I mentioned the word reconciliation is because of the fact that there were a lot of people out there who risked their lives, and I'm not talking just black. I'm talking there were white people out there
Yeah.
who were never acknowledged by the mere fact that had some of the white people not spoken up, some of the abolitionists, if you will, we would probably still be where we are in slavery. So it took that cluster of white people to say, you know what,
Yeah.
this is wrong here. And they stood up.
And even the
Right.
postal employee that gives Oscar Mack the
Absolutely.
handgun.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So because we hear and we paint, cultures with one stroke of a paintbrush. Well, all white people are like this. No,
Yeah.
we have to individualize here.
We do, because otherwise we take their agency from them. Because people had a choice to make even back then.
That's right.
It's the hardest thing for our students to actually understand, because they think, back then, all people acted like that. All white people hated black people.
Exactly. Right.
And but I mean, this is a really incredible story. So this was C.C. Collins was the white assistant postmaster. I have that.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's another kind of pathway is for us to do some,
C.C. Collins.
yeah, C.C. Collins, so we can find
And
him in a
that's the person who
census.
gave him the gun?
Yes, ma'am.
Oh.
That's a great, that's a great lead, you know, kind
He
of,
might still be living there. Just Mrs.
And I wonder if the military, because, you know, he was honorably discharged, I wonder if they helped him.
that's what I'm thinking, you know, because, you know, I know we never joined, my father, I mean, I'm from a long line of Hispanic military veterans. We never joined the mainstream groups like the American Legion or the VFW because of their history of racism. But we, after World War II, my grandparents' generation created the American GI Forum. So it was for, and it still exists. It's still
Right.
very active. African American veterans, after the Civil War, create their own kind of parallel organizations. So that's a really good possibility, Vanessa. I mean,
Yeah. I speak to a lot of vets because of my job, and you'd be surprised of the conversation that we have.
right.
And a lot of them don't see black and white when I'm talking to them because they've been exposed to basically in front of death. And I had one guy, white gentleman, that came back and he's, you know, doesn't like the way some of the people in minority are being treated, and he's white. But they seem, because he has like 7 people that became his family in the military. So he may have had that same type of connection, and they may have helped him.
I would love to find out what unit he was in. I mean, I think we can find that out.
Yeah.
And then,
There's only like 3, maybe.
well, no, there's several, but
But I mean, it went to France.
Yeah.
They fought in France.
they also had reunions. You know, there may be a whole other dimension here of what we can do. Most of the units most of what they call the colored units were organized under the 92nd Division, under the Allied Expeditionary Force. And that leaves its own, not James Weldon Johnson, but the gentleman who worked for years for Booker T. Washington. I'm blanking his name now. But he wrote the history of the 92nd Division. So,
Yes, when World War II started, that was it. And we asked France, who should we send, you know, do you want troops to come help you? And France said, well, we would just like to have those black troops back. That's for the 92nd.
You had made mention of that earlier, yes.
yeah.
Yeah, I think France was more accepting than any other European country.
They wanted to win the war. they had been invaded. It's
But yeah,
yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
even as my friend says today, if you go to France, if you're an American black, they love you. If you're an African, they don't love you. You come to the United States, if you're an African, they love you. If you're an American black,
And,
it's just exactly
yeah.
opposite.
I remember the story, maybe you've heard it, my dad often told us that when the American blacks ended up going to Germany, there was a lie that their counterparts had put out about black American men having tails.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
my father fought in Germany and France, and he loved the people.
Yeah, I heard they were treated much better.
Hosea Williams said that when he came, I'm sorry, baby, when he came back from serving in Germany, he said that he had killed a lot of Germans, and he walked in to a public facility, I believe, in Alabama, and he had his fatigues on, and he went to the water fountain to get some water to drink from that water fountain that was segregated, and he said they beat him right there on the spot, fatigues and all. Yeah.
That's horrible.
Okay.
Wow.
Okay.
Are there other things we should talk about before, as we're kind of winding up? Any other questions?